Hi everyone, and we are back with the APIM Hotrod. Hey Stefan, how are you?
Hey, Massimo, fine, and you?
Very
What's up?
good, thank you. It's Monday
Yes,
today
indeed.
when we are recording.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So today we will talk about APIM in a hybrid setup. So how flows from let's say on premises to the cloud.
Yep.
So we will
Indeed.
just look this into a sort of a context of enterprise scenario, right?
Yeah, indeed. That's the goal. So basically, we know that we have a lot of hybrid architectures today, right? Some, of course, cloud-only apps, but also some hybrid apps, or some apps that could be in the cloud or APIs that, but for the clients, for which the clients would still be on premises. So that's a bit what I would like to show, let's say, and that we can talk about, of course. So I prepared
Okay.
a few things to
Okay,
discuss.
so I will bring some screen into the stage,
Yep.
and here you go.
Good. So, well, basically here, I let me just show you first the global context. So that's a repo that's available here. So on GitHub, I'm talking about APIM, but not only. There are plenty of other resources there. But so I created a page here so that you can also have a look later on after this video if you want to see this at your own pace. And so, of course, I start with advertising the APIM Hotrod show, but that's what you are looking at right now. So that's it. And so here it's really tackling the a hybrid setup for indeed on-prem clients to cloud. So meaning that, of course, you could have the other way around. So I will not talk about this today, but we can cover this in the, let's say, at a later stage or in another episode. And so here, of course, I explain a little bit the context, what you have, but let's dive into a diagram. I give some explanations there, and then, of course, you can always come back and read. And of course, Massimo, feel free to interact if you have any questions along the way. So that the first diagram is a bit a lengthy one, so I'll try to start from the logical order, so from the client. So that would be the on-premise environment, right? High level diagram here. And basically, of course, as you might know or you should know, basically on-premise environments are typically, let's say, plugged to the or connected to the cloud environment thanks to ExpressRoute or site-to-site VPN. So you have basically a way to make those two worlds interact. And typically, this is in a hub and spoke topology, right? Which is also very described in this repo. And so the hub and spoke topology, of course, means that typically a hub will be a virtual network with some system functions, some functions that it needs, services that it needs to provide to others, and the spokes would be, let's say, applications, right? And either you have one application per spoke, so one VNet hosts one application. You could share. It all depends on how you want to segment your networking strategy and landscape. And so basically here in the very basic example here, so we have basically the target service. So say that this is the API I want to expose to on-prem clients. So that's my backend service that developers would have just developed and hosted on either a web app, could be AKS cluster, could be basically anything here. Um, and so, and then you have the hub, right? And so, of course, we know that the hub and spokes are peered. So the spokes are peered to the hubs, of course, just to make sure that connectivity can be done. And typically, in the hub, you would have something like an Azure firewall or an NVA, network virtual appliance, can be anything, any brand, let's say, but it will do the same job, meaning forwarding traffic, right, and also applying firewall rules to let it go or not. And so, typically, if we take the flow direction, what we have here is that we have the on-premise client that would go through the gateway subnet, which is something that let's say is a system name of the subnet, so you cannot a system subnet, sorry. So that's where the traffic lands, and then typically what we do in every company is that traffic leaving that subnet here is often sent to a firewall, right? So all traffic. And so in this case, traffic would fly from the gateway subnet to a firewall, and then from the firewall to APIM in this case, because the client, of course, would hate or would request, let's say, an endpoint that is here. And then from here, you have, let's say, two possibilities. That's what I showed as the green line, right? And then the red line. So let's start with the simple one, the red line. So it's red because it's maybe not the preferred way to go. But red line means you start with a common route, like the black route here. So because that one you cannot avoid anyway. So you end up on the firewall, which forwards it to the APIM. And so at the level of APIM, because APIM is in the hub, it has already a native connectivity to all the spokes that are peer to that hub. Okay, so you might just say, you know what, I have my backend here, I have the open API specification of that backend that is published here, and so now I know where my backend is, and I just let APIM call that backend. That would work, and that's what I call the VNet peering route, right? So we have connectivity, and that could be good enough. But you have an alternative that would say, okay, from APIM itself, you send back the traffic to the firewall before the firewall comes back to the backend. And so, meaning in this case that you would have, that's why it's also kind of red here, you would have to write some routes in a route table to basically make sure that the traffic leaving APIM is going back to the firewall and then sent to the backend. So you could say, okay, it might be seen as overkill. Might say, okay, I already have connectivity. But just keep in mind that API management has the policy engine, right? And with policies, you can write actually policies like send request, where you could basically, reach out to an endpoint that is actually outside of your reach here, right? That might not be the backend itself. That might be something else. And so if you want to make sure that you control this, then sending it back to the firewall is a way to go. Of course, that's not the most cloud native practice, right? That's more okay, making sure that this one cannot be bypassed. And then, of course, firewall is always blocking everything by default. So then if you have an endpoint here that is called by a send request policy, it should be blocked by default. So then you need to open it up. So then somebody knows that you are doing something with your policies. Of course, you could put mitigations in place to make sure that, I don't know, with pull requests and so on APIM, or if it's a centrally managed APIM, depending a bit on the organization, you might have another team reviewing policies and so on. It depends on what you want to do. But let's say if you go, let's say, with a green pass, then you're sure that in any case, whatever APIM is talking to, it will go through the firewall. So you have, let's say, one, let's say, a system that will check these kind of stuff. So that's one flavor. Massimo, any
Stefan,
question on this one? Yep, tell me.
yeah, I think we can stay 2 minutes on this, and I just for a couple of questions. So
Yep.
before moving to the next one, so can we say that in this context, the green route
Yep.
is we can call it the zero trust approach?
But it's more than this, because that's really still heavily focused on network, while zero trust is actually a combination of all, right? So meaning that every step, but this is contributing to a zero trust. But on top of this, you would of course need to make sure to have other kind of checks, like for instance, by it's not that I want to give brand names, but like using Netscope, Zscaler, that kind of solutions also contribute to zero trust, also based on identity, right?
Yeah.
What is talking to what beyond network? Here is still heavily network centric, but that contributes to indeed ultimately to a zero trust security posture. Yeah.
And
Uh,
maybe the last one before going is
yep.
just like very quickly it was to mention. So here we are putting, I mean, the API management in the hub.
Yep.
And maybe this is done according to you for cost sharing cost reasons, and then it brings the challenging of managing. Just that's what you
Yes.
see normally.
Yeah.
Just
Indeed.
quick
Indeed. So,
after that we already. I mean,
yeah.
we already discussed this in other scenario, but I mean,
Yeah.
because we are showing this, maybe 2 seconds on this.
Yeah, no, no, indeed. So that's right. So API management, and there is a section, by the way, in this page, right, that I said, okay, using workspaces or not at the end, right? This and workspaces
Okay.
are a way indeed to share an instance, but indeed here the goal is, of course, to have one API management instance, whether you use workspaces or not, that deals with hybrid HTTP traffic, API traffic from the cloud to on-prem. You could also use it from on-prem to the cloud. You could also use it the other way around. But indeed, and the goal is, of course, to try to minimize cost. But indeed, it poses us some challenge in terms of, okay, then who is the owner of the instance? How do you make sure that projects do not, let's say, interfere with each other? But indeed, and because the alternative could be, of course, that you put an APIM, for instance, here in
Yeah.
every spoke, right? But then, of course, it means that if you have one dedicated API gateway per app, that of course will lead to extra cost for sure. So, but yeah, That's
let's
indeed a
move.
good point.
Okay, for
Yeah.
the next one, so we move from the API management,
Yeah.
I suppose, from the hub to an application spoke.
Yes, indeed, to actually a dedicated spoke. So that would not be an application spoke, right? Because otherwise we would have then one gateway per spoke,
Pure
which then,
application. Yeah, yeah.
but here you see. So why did I illustrate this one as well? Is that because depending on the organizations, some organizations don't like to put anything in the spoke, in the hub, sorry, other than the firewall. Right, for instance, the NVA or firewall, and that's it, and maybe DNS, and that's it. While others are more flexible. I advocate for this one. Why? Because I think that the hub needs to be able to serve all the duties that that it was created for. I also have customers working with multi-hubs, so not only one hub, but we have purpose-built hubs, like something to only deal with the internet incoming traffic, internet outgoing traffic, and so that leads, of course, to extra cost. But if you have purpose-built hubs, you must make sure to equip that hub with all the things it needs to serve the its purpose basically. And so, but yet, if you would say, okay, I don't want to pollute, you could see that as a pollution of the hub, my hub, with, let's say, APIM or any other service, then of course you can put that service aside in a separate VNet, which would be then a spoke. But if you do this, of course, then you cannot bypass the firewall. At least if you take the green path here, then you still have your on-prem client going here. Of course, it would then from the firewall you would send traffic to API management, and API management would be forced to basically go back to the firewall to let's say go to the application spoke. One thing still, the red route here would allow you to bypass the firewall, so between APIM and the spoke, but it's typically not something that you would do in a hub and spoke scenario, because in a hub and spoke scenario, you avoid peering spokes together, right? But if you still would peer those two together, then of course you would have also direct connectivity through the peering routes, which, but you would typically not do that. And so then in that case, the green path would be client, firewall, APIM, firewall, and then backend, right? So meaning that, of course, you need to also whitelist and have like an application rule here. Same for the first scenario, by the way, but application rule that would then, of course, allow traffic to the backend. Okay, so also something I forgot to mention today, right? It could change the future, but today, if you take the premium flavor, because I only consider APIM Premium in this case, so fully VNet integrated for both inbound and outbound. Um, Today, still, it is sensitive to customer VNets. So the routes that you define here can actually interfere with how APIM works. So one thing that you anyway always need to do is to make sure that everything that is destined to API management service stack is actually directly going to internet, and you don't send this to a file, because if you do this, you just break APIM. This is documented as well, but that's something to keep in mind. So you cannot send all the traffic to the firewall, because you would break it just for this one. Okay, the first line here. Um, so, and then why would you do this? Well, if you find it easier to, let's say, have this in a separate spoke instead of in the hub, that could be a reason why you would basically isolate. If you want to enforce the firewall, because of course here, providing you do not peer those two together, then the only way to go back from APIM to the backend is to go to the firewall. So that's an easy way to make sure that firewall cannot be bypassed. Here, of course, in the first flavor, since the APIM is already, let's say, peer to hold the target spokes, then of course somehow connectivity is already there, right? So the only way to force it is to make sure that the routes are written properly. You see, while here, if you don't peer the APIM spoke with the other spokes, then they cannot talk together anyway, right? So the only way back is through the firewall. Okay, so that's but something to also consider, and that's why I'm trying to pay attention now, is that uh, a hub, for instance, any VNet is limited in terms of how many peerings you can have, right? It's 500 peerings per VNet today, meaning that it could actually go fast. If you start to create VNets for everything, then you will burn some peerings, and that might actually, in the end, hit you back, right? Especially if you have a single hub for everything. I know some small customers who have even a single hub for both production and non-production. Then the number of spokes you could have ultimately will really grow fast. You have this, and you have also the number of routes that are limited to 400 routes per route table, which can also be a very limiting factor. And these two are hard limits. So if you reach them, it's game over. I mean, then the only possibility would be to have another hub on the side to accommodate the other routes that you need to have. Massimo, any question on this one?
I think it's very clear. I mean, also the first one, but I have nothing to add in this case. It's
good.
just go
And
ahead.
then it's still very resembling, but I wanted to see also how we can do with Azure Virtual One, right? Because typically a lot of customers have the hub and spoke, and you could say that Azure Virtual One is like a managed hub and spoke. Okay, in the default hub and spoke model, the two first examples I showed, you have to route traffic yourself, right? With Virtual One, you have a default behavior that is enforced by default. And in Virtual One, there is one difference, is that you work with what is called virtual hubs, spokes remain spokes, and virtual hubs are fully managed by Microsoft. So meaning that you cannot create anything inside of the hub. So unlike the first flavor where you decide what you want to put in the hub or not, with virtual hubs, there is no choice. It's managed by Microsoft. So it's like a black box. And so basically here, you have two flavors, let's say. One is, of course, then to have an APIM spoke that's mandatory because you cannot put APIM in the hub anyway. And the default behavior is that the virtual hubs ship with a default router. So meaning that in Virtual One, by default, any spoke that is joined to V1 or to a hub here will have an any-to-any connectivity. Right? This is actually ensured by the router. So meaning that if you just create a separate VNet for APIM, you put it there, then of course the client would still go there, and actually you would be able to reach the target spoke without any thing that you have to do yourself in terms of routing. Okay, that's the default behavior. But of course, in this case, you have no firewall. So some companies, might say, yeah, it's good enough. It's internal traffic. I don't care. But remember that, of course, your APIM could actually go to internet and so on. So that's also something to keep in mind. But that's one flavor that works. So I explained a bit, put some text onto it. And then you have the alternative, which is working with what is called a secure virtual hub instead of virtual hub. So that's still Microsoft managed, but you can enable an NVA or a firewall. So you will, for instance, if you take Azure Firewall, you have like a firewall policy and you say, okay, I will enable that policy for this virtual secure hub. And basically then you can make sure that like in the traditional hub and spoke that you route traffic to a firewall. But in this case, uh, uh, it's actually quite simple with V1, is that you can work with what is called routing intents. So you define routing intents for both private and internet traffic, or either of those you can choose. And then once they are defined at the level of the hub, they will be propagated to all spokes that are connected to the hub. So meaning that in this case, the only route you would still need is this one, right, in APIM to let, again, that you cannot send to a firewall for the reason I said as earlier. But all the rest, let's say, will be by default be sent to the firewall. And of course, then you would still have to open up the application rules and so on, like in the other flavors. So these are two ways, let's say, of sharing an APIM instance in traditional hub and spoke or in virtual one. And then, of course, and that was highlighted by Massimo, we spoke about this one. Do you use workspaces or not? Workspaces today are the building block they are meant to actually share a single instance across project teams. Still, today, there are still some serious limitations that are documented here, right? So, of course, before saying, okay, we go for workspace or not, you also need to see, let's say, what you ask your APIM instance to do. Do you work with custom host names, for instance, for DNS and so on? That is not supported today by workspaces, so that's important. If you at some point, that's going to be for a next episode, but if you use APIM to actually proxy on-prem backends, then you will also have to trust a custom certificate authority, for instance. That is also not supported by workspaces today. There are alternatives, but we'll come to this in another episode. So, Massimo.
Yeah, so workspaces is something that we really have to. I mean, I believe everyone has to keep their radar on, and it will mature in the coming months. So we are at the first step. We will see the evolution. I just want to just recap a little bit. If you go on the top of your article here. So in general, just like sharing a little bit your experience. So you already said that. the one that you advise is to have, let's say, the API management in the hub, and you explain why. And now it's similar question. So that's what you advise. And my question for you, or to share here a little as we are closing this episode, is what did you see the most? So there is what we advise and what we face in real life. So I would just like to, in my case, I see a lot of, a lot of time in this setup where, especially for a cost control, and also a lot of time setups where you have API management in the application context. So another spoke, but not from infrastructure, but more for applications.
Indeed. So today I see a lot still of API management instances dedicated to some apps. But then, of course, some organizations just come back from it because it's too costly, right? It actually depends, and that's really important as well, on what are the security requirements and more specifically network requirements, right? If you really need to be fully isolated, then typically you would use premium. And that is, of course, not something that you can afford to pay for every app, right? At some point, the cost will hit you back. So, but as soon as you go for shared APIM, I see two setups or three. I really see this, right? I also saw the other one, so that's all inspired from real world, but also what I explained once about integration landing zones. I don't know if you remember, we discussed that in another episode, where you would actually have a purpose-built integration landing zone that is not belonging to any of the apps, but where all apps would actually put their, so it would resemble, let's say, this one in the end. Right.
It's the second one where your spoke is a spoke that is specialized spoke. Let's call it like this. Or,
indeed, for integration stuff, and where you would also typically have maybe some service namespaces, other integration building blocks that you would have in integration landing zone that could bridge on-prem and the applications, right? But that is more something I have seen in organizations that have an integration team. You see, you see, and actually, even when you share, indeed, that as soon as you share an instance across apps, then you always need to see what is the organization model around, what is the operating model, because indeed, with workspaces, that would make it. And the problem is that today still lack some features, but of course, workspaces are the ideal way to fix this. Right, because then you can still give a lot of autonomy to application teams, project teams, with a certainty that they will not interfere with each other, right? While if you really share a single instance without workspaces, then you really need to polish your RBAC.
That's true. That's true. But at the end, there is always a but, which is the governance. Since even if with the workspaces, the sort of platform team, the one that shared the shared, let's say, assets of the API management instance, that team still have to make sure that have procedures and governance in place. It's unavoidable, right?
Indeed, but I would say some companies are, let's say, more more tolerant, let's say, for internal apps, because of course here we only talk about internal APIs and they are not customer facing in this case, right? Where sometimes the governance is actually stricter for internet facing, because of course internet facing there is also the image of the company, right? If you expose 10 APIs to really external customers and they, from a taxonomy, for instance, standpoint, are not RESTful like or whatsoever, or it looks like it's another company that built API A, B, and C. That is not something you can afford, at least if you want to keep a good reputation. For internal APIs, of course, some companies are more again tolerant somehow because it's not exposed to the external world. But governance in any case is required to make sure that you don't destroy or that someone cannot harm, let's say, another project on the same instance. But let's say so in any case you need some governance. That's unavoidable, hence the link with the operating model.
Okay, cool, very cool. I think we are at the end of this episode for today. I think it was a very interesting topic. So I want to thank you, Stefan, and everyone who will watch this episode in the coming days.
Yeah, thank you, Massimo. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.